Poor single dad saw a woman crying on a blind date. What she said changed their lives forever. Before we continue, please tell us where in the world are you tuning in from? We love seeing how far our stories travel. Dominic Hayes sat at the counter of Joe's Diner in Denver on Valentine's Day at 7:15 in the evening. With $2.37 in his pocket, nursing a cup of coffee that he was making last as long as humanly possible, and he was only there because his truck had broken down 3 blocks away, and he was waiting for the bus that wouldn't come for another 20 minutes. He just finished a 12-hour shift at the auto shop, and he was still covered in grease under his fingernails, and his back hurt, and his stomach was growling because that coffee was going to be his dinner. But he couldn't afford anything else until his paycheck hit on Friday, which was 3 whole days away. Here's the thing about being a poor single dad to an 8-year-old daughter when your wife died 4 years ago, in childbirth along with the baby she was carrying. Valentine's Day feels like the universe is personally mocking you, because everywhere you look there are happy couples holding hands and buying flowers and celebrating love while you're sitting alone at a diner counter, pretending that a $2 cup of coffee is a satisfying meal. Dom's daughter Sophie was at their neighbor Rita's apartment, this sweet elderly lady who watched her for free because she knew Dom was barely scraping by, and he'd promised Sophie he'd be home by 8 to tuck her in and read her a bedtime story, even though he was so exhausted he could barely see straight. He was checking his phone for the third time to see how long until the bus came when a woman walked into the diner looking nervous and put together in a way that made it obvious she was there for a date. And she sat down in the booth directly behind Dom, checking her phone every 10 seconds like she was either really excited or really dreading whatever was about to happen. About 5 minutes later, a guy in an expensive suit walked in and said, "Vanessa," loud enough that Dom heard it from his spot at the counter, and the woman said, "Yes, hi, you must be Marcus. It's nice to meet you," in this voice that was trying really hard to sound confident, but came out shaky instead. Dom went back to his coffee and his phone trying to mind his own business. But the booths and the counter were back to back with basically no sound barrier, so he ended up hearing their entire conversation whether he wanted to or not. They did the normal first date small talk about jobs and hobbies, and Dom learned that the woman Vanessa was a nurse, and the guy Marcus worked in finance and liked skiing and traveling, and it all sounded perfectly boring and normal until Marcus said, "So your profile mentioned you like spending time with family. Do you have siblings or what?" Vanessa's voice got quieter and she said, "I have a 5-year-old son. His name is Oliver. He's my whole world." And there was this pause that Dom could feel even with his back turned. And Marcus said, "Oh, you have a kid. Your profile didn't mention that. I'm not really looking to date single moms, if I'm being honest. That's kind of a deal breaker for me." Dom's hand tightened around his coffee mug because what kind of person says something like that out loud? But Vanessa tried to recover and said, "I understand it's a lot to take on, but Oliver is an incredible little boy, and he's so brave and smart." Marcus made this uncomfortable noise and said, "How old did you say, 5? So you've got like 13 more years before he's out of the house. That's a pretty serious commitment." And Vanessa's voice cracked when she said, "Actually, he's sick. He has terminal brain cancer. He's in hospice care at home. The doctors say he has weeks or maybe a couple months left if we're lucky." The entire diner seemed to go silent, even though Dom knew people were still talking, and he heard Marcus say, "Jesus Christ, that's really heavy. I'm sorry, but I absolutely cannot do this. I didn't sign up for dating someone with a dying kid. That's way too much baggage." Dom heard a chair scrape and turned just enough to see Marcus standing up and throwing some cash on the table. And the guy actually said, "Good luck with everything. I hope it works out for you." Like he was wishing her well on a job interview instead of abandoning her because her 5-year-old son was dying. Marcus walked out without looking back, and Dom saw Vanessa put her face in her hands and start crying. Not loud, dramatic crying, but the kind of quiet sobbing that's somehow worse because you can tell she's trying so hard to hold it together. The waitress came over and asked if Vanessa was okay, and she said, "I'm fine. Can I just get the check, please?" Even though she was clearly not fine, and Dom sat there feeling his blood boil because how could someone be that cruel? How could you look at a grieving mother and just walk away like her pain was an inconvenience? He thought about his own daughter Sophie waiting at home, thought about his wife Olivia, who died bringing their second baby into the world, thought about all the ways life can break you and how the least we can do is show up for each other. Before he could talk himself out of it, Dom stood up and walked over to Vanessa's booth and said, "I'm really sorry to bother you. I know this is weird, but I was sitting right behind you and I heard everything. And I just wanted to say that guy is a complete asshole and you deserve so much better." Vanessa looked up at him with mascara running down her face and said, "You heard all of that? Oh my God, I'm so embarrassed." And Dom slid into the seat across from her without asking and said, "Don't be embarrassed. You didn't do anything wrong. He's the one who should be ashamed." He stuck out his grease-stained hand and said, "I'm Dominic. Everyone calls me Dom. I'm a mechanic, and I was sitting at the counter eavesdropping on your terrible date, apparently." And Vanessa laughed this watery laugh and shook his hand and said, "I'm Vanessa. Most people call me Nessa. I'm a nurse, and I clearly have the worst luck in the world when it comes to blind dates." Dom said, "Can I buy you a coffee or something? Or actually, I can only afford coffee, so I guess that's your only option. But I can offer you some company if you want it." Nessa wiped her eyes and said, "You don't have to do that. You don't even know me." And Dom said, "I know you're a mom with a sick kid who just got treated like garbage by someone who doesn't deserve to breathe the same air as you. That's enough for me." They sat there for over an hour talking, and Dom learned that Nessa's son Oliver had been diagnosed with an inoperable brain tumor when he was 2 years old, that she'd spent the last 3 years watching him go through chemo and radiation and surgeries, and that his cancer had progressed to the point where they'd made the decision to stop treatments and focus on keeping him comfortable for whatever time he had left. She told him about her ex-boyfriend who'd walked out the day they got the diagnosis, saying he couldn't handle it, about the $200,000 in medical debt she'd never be able to pay off, about working night shifts so she could be with Oliver during the day, and about how her best friend Jenna had basically forced her to go on this blind date tonight because she needed one night of normal. Dom told her about Olivia dying 4 years ago along with their baby, about raising Sophie on a mechanic's salary that barely covered rent, about his truck breaking down today, which was ironic considering he fixes cars for a living, and about how he understood that specific kind of loneliness that comes from being a single parent with nobody to share the load. When the waitress brought the check, Dom grabbed it before Nessa could and paid with his emergency $20 bill that he kept hidden in his wallet for actual emergencies. And Nessa saw how little money he had and said, "You can't afford this. You said you only have enough for coffee." And Dom said, "Neither can you. We're both broke. At least tonight we can be broke together." They walked out of the diner at the same time, and Dom's bus was pulling up to the stop. And Nessa said, "Thank you for tonight, for seeing me when I felt invisible. I don't know how to thank you enough." Dom pulled out his phone and said, "This is going to sound forward, but can I give you my number? Not for a date or anything. Just if you ever need someone to talk to. Someone who gets what it's like." And Nessa took his number and saved it in her phone, and they said goodbye. That night at 11 o'clock, Dom was in bed half asleep when his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. And when he answered, Nessa's voice came through shaking, and she said, "I'm so sorry to call this late. Oliver's having a really bad night with the pain, and I just needed to talk to someone who wouldn't tell me everything's going to be okay when we both know it's not." Dom sat up in bed and said, "It's not okay, and it's okay to say that out loud. Tell me about him. What's Oliver like when he's feeling good?" And Nessa talked for 2 solid hours about her son, about his love for superheroes, and how he still smiled even when he was hurting. And Dom listened to every single word, thinking that maybe the universe had put him in that diner tonight for a reason neither of them understood yet. 6 days after Valentine's Day, Dom called Nessa around noon and said something that made her stop in the middle of folding laundry. He said, "I know this might be too much to ask, but I'd really like to meet Oliver if that's okay with you. I've heard so much about him, and I just feel like I should know the kid who's got the bravest mom I've ever met." Nessa was quiet for a long time, and then she said, "I don't let people meet him. It's too hard when they leave. Everyone always leaves eventually." And Dom said, "I'm not everyone, and I'm not going anywhere. But if you're not ready, I understand." She invited him over that same afternoon, and when Dom walked into Nessa's small apartment, He had to work really hard to keep his face neutral because the living room had been completely converted into a medical space. There was a hospital bed where the couch should have been, and IV poles and oxygen tanks and monitors everywhere. Oliver was tiny for 5 years old, completely bald from the chemotherapy with these huge brown eyes that took up half his face. And he was wearing Spider-Man pajamas, even though it was the middle of the day. And when he saw Dom standing in the doorway, he said in this small voice, "Are you my mom's friend?" Dom walked over and knelt down next to the bed, so he was at Oliver's eye level, and said, "Yeah, buddy, I'm your mom's friend. My name's Dom. I heard you really like superheroes." And Oliver's whole face lit up even though he looked exhausted. And he said, "I love Spider-Man the most because he's regular like me, but he does amazing things." They spent the whole afternoon watching cartoons together with Oliver, explaining the plot of every show in detail, even though his voice kept getting tired. And Nessa watched from the kitchen doorway, crying quiet tears because nobody besides medical staff had voluntarily spent time with Oliver in over a year. 2 weeks later, Dom brought Sophie to meet Nessa and Oliver, and he'd warned his daughter ahead of time that Oliver was really sick and might look different than other kids she knew. But Sophie walked right up to Oliver's bed and said with zero filter, "Hi, I'm Sophie. My mom died when I was 4, so I know what it's like when really sad things happen. You're really brave." Oliver looked at her with surprise and said, "Your mom died? I'm gonna die too. The doctors told my mom." And instead of getting scared, Sophie just climbed up on the bed next to him and said, "I know, but you're still here right now. Do you want to color with me?" Dom and Nessa stood in the kitchen watching their kids become instant friends, and Nessa said, "Your daughter's absolutely incredible. She didn't even flinch." And Dom said, "She's been around death. She gets it in a way most kids don't. Your son is pretty amazing too." They were standing close enough that Dom could smell Nessa's shampoo, and he said, "I'm falling for you. Is that crazy considering everything we're dealing with?" And Nessa looked up at him with tears in her eyes and said, "If it's crazy, then we're both completely insane, because I'm falling for you too." She said, "I can't promise you any kind of future, Dom. I don't know what's going to happen or how long Oliver has. I can't plan past today." And Dom kissed her for the first time right there in her kitchen and said, "I don't need promises. I don't need plans. I just need today and tomorrow and whatever comes after that." They started seeing each other as much as Dom's work schedule and Nessa's caregiving allowed, and it felt like they were building something real in the middle of the hardest circumstances either of them had ever faced. In mid-March, Oliver needed a specialized pain medication that the hospice nurse said would make him much more comfortable. But Nessa's insurance company denied it, saying it wasn't medically necessary, even though her son was literally dying, and the out-of-pocket cost was $800 a week. Nessa called Dom crying so hard she could barely speak and said, "I can't afford it. I can't give him the one thing that would help with the pain. What kind of mother can't afford to keep her dying child comfortable?" Dom picked up extra shifts at the auto shop, working 80 hours a week until his hands were permanently stained with grease and his back screamed every time he stood up. And he showed up at Nessa's apartment 3 days later with $800 in cash. She tried to refuse, and they had this huge fight where she said, "I can't take your money. You're barely surviving as it is." And Dom said, "Let me do this, please. I can't fix Oliver, and I can't take away the pain. But I can do this one thing. Let me help." Dom's boss at the shop was this guy named Ray, who'd known Dom since he started working there 8 years ago. And when Ray found out what was happening, he started a fundraiser with all the other mechanics, and they raised $5,000 in 2 weeks from people who'd never even met Oliver. Nessa was completely overwhelmed when Dom showed up with a check and said, "This is from everyone at the shop. They wanted to help." And she broke down in his arms and said, "I don't deserve this. I don't deserve you." By April, they were basically a family. Even though nobody had made it official, Dom was staying at Nessa's apartment most nights, helping with Oliver's overnight care. And Sophie was there every weekend reading books to Oliver when he was too tired to play. One afternoon, Oliver looked at Nessa and said, "Is Dom going to be my dad?" And Nessa's voice shook when she said, "Would you want that, sweetheart?" And Oliver smiled and said, "Yeah, he's really nice. And Sophie's like the sister I always wanted." When Nessa told Dom what Oliver had said, he had to sit down because his legs literally stopped working. And he said, I would be so honored to be his dad for whatever time he has left. And they both cried together on Nessa's couch. Late April came, and Oliver started declining fast. He was sleeping 18 hours a day, and the pain medication wasn't working as well anymore. And the hospice nurse pulled Nessa aside and said, "It's time to start saying goodbyes. We're talking days now, not weeks." Sophie came to say goodbye on May 2nd, and she held Oliver's hand and said, "I'm going to remember you forever, okay? And someday when I have kids, I'm going to tell them all about my friend Oliver, who was the bravest person I ever knew." And Oliver whispered, "Will you tell them I love Spider-Man?" And Sophie said, "Every single time I tell the story." Dom had to leave the room because he was crying too hard to be useful. Oliver passed away at 3:47 in the morning on May 4th, with Nessa holding him and Dom holding her and Sophie asleep on the couch nearby. And it was quiet and peaceful and absolutely devastating all at the same time. The weeks after were a blur of funeral arrangements and paperwork, and Nessa moving through her life like a ghost. She quit her job at the hospital because she couldn't face the pediatric oncology ward anymore. And Dom moved her into his place because she couldn't stay in the apartment surrounded by medical equipment and memories. Sophie tried to help by bringing Nessa glasses of water and sitting with her when she cried. And one day she said, "It's okay to be sad, Nessa. My dad says grief is just love with nowhere to go." And Nessa hugged her and thought about how this 8-year-old understood pain better than most adults. 2 months went by, and Nessa barely left the house. And on July 4th, Dom came home from work to find her packing her bags, and his heart just stopped. He said, "What are you doing? Where are you going?" And Nessa wouldn't look at him when she said, "I'm leaving. This isn't fair to you. You didn't sign up for any of this." And Dom said, "Don't do this. Please don't run." But she kept packing. She said, "You've given me everything, Dom, your time and your money and your home and your daughter's love. And all I've given you is grief and pain. Oliver's gone, and there's no reason for you to stay anymore." Dom grabbed her hands and made her look at him and said, "I'm not staying because of Oliver. I'm staying because I love you. I fell in love with you that night in the diner, and I'm still in love with you now." And Nessa was crying so hard she could barely breathe. She said, "I don't know how to be a person without him. I don't know who I am when I'm not Oliver's mom. I don't know how to do this." And Dom said, "Then we'll figure it out together. But don't leave. Please don't leave." Nessa pulled her hands away and picked up her bag and said, "I need space. I need to figure out who I am now. I'm sorry." And she walked out the door, leaving Dom standing in the middle of his living room, feeling like his heart had been ripped out of his chest all over again. 3 months went by after Nessa left, and Dom felt like he was walking through his life completely underwater. Everything was muffled and distant, and nothing had any color or meaning anymore. He was just going through the motions of waking up and going to work and taking care of Sophie without actually being present for any of it. Sophie asked him every single day, "Is Nessa coming back? Do you think she misses us? Can we please call her and tell her we love her?" And Dom had to look his 8-year-old daughter in the eyes and say, "I don't know, sweetheart, I really hope so. But sometimes people need space to heal, and we have to let them go, even when it hurts." What Dom didn't tell Sophie was that he lay awake every night staring at the ceiling, thinking about Nessa, wondering if she was okay, if she was eating, if she was drowning in grief with nobody there to pull her back to the surface. He'd pick up his phone 100 times a day to text her and then put it back down because she'd asked for space, and he had to respect that, even though it was killing him slowly from the inside out. Nessa was staying with her best friend Jenna in a spare bedroom that felt more like a cage than a safe place, and she was going to therapy twice a week, sitting on a couch across from a woman named Dr. Rivera, who kept asking really hard questions that Nessa didn't want to answer. Dr. Rivera would say, "Why did you leave Dominic? Walk me through your thought process." And Nessa would say, "Because I don't deserve him, because I'm broken, because he only stayed out of pity for the woman with the dying kid. And now that Oliver's gone, there's no reason for him to stick around." Every single time Nessa said something like that, Dr. Rivera would lean forward and say, "Is that actually true, or is that what your grief is telling you?" But Nessa couldn't hear it, couldn't let herself believe that someone like Dom would actually choose someone as damaged and broken as she felt. On September 15th, which would have been Oliver's 6th birthday, Nessa woke up feeling like someone had poured concrete into her chest and she couldn't get out of bed for hours. Around 2 in the afternoon, Jenna knocked on the door and said, "Nessa, honey, there's a package here for you. It's from Dr. Patel at the hospital." And Nessa forced herself to get up and sign for it with shaking hands. Inside the box was a letter, and she recognized Oliver's dictation at the top, even though the handwriting belonged to one of his nurses. And she sat down on the floor right there in the hallway and started reading. The letter said, "To my mom, if you're reading this, then I'm already gone. And I'm probably with the superheroes now, which is pretty cool. But I need to tell you some important things before you spend the rest of your life being sad. I know you're going to miss me so much, and that's okay. I miss you too, even though I'm not there anymore. But Mom, you have to promise me you won't stop living just because I did." Nessa was already sobbing so hard she could barely see the words, but she kept reading through the tears. "I want you to be happy, Mom, like really truly happy. And I know Dom makes you happy because I saw your face change when he was around. You smiled different, like you weren't just pretending anymore. Dom is really nice and he loves you so much I could tell. And Sophie is the best sister I ever had, even though I only got to know her for a little while. She's brave like you, and I want you to have a family with them." Nessa had to stop reading and just cry for a few minutes before she could continue. And Oliver's letter went on to say, "Don't push Dom away because you think you don't deserve to be happy. You deserve everything good, Mom. You took care of me every single day, and you never gave up even when things got really hard. Now it's your turn to let someone take care of you." The letter ended with, "Be happy for me, okay? Live a big, beautiful life and think about me sometimes. But don't be sad forever. I love you more than all the stars in the sky. Love, Oliver. P.S. Tell Sophie she has to tell her kids about me someday," she promised, and I'm holding her to it. Nessa sat on that hallway floor, holding the letter against her chest, and realized with absolute clarity that she'd been doing exactly what Oliver asked her not to do. She'd been punishing herself for surviving when he didn't. And she'd pushed away the man who loved her, because her grief told her she didn't deserve happiness. She stood up and grabbed her car keys and drove straight to Dom's house without even changing out of her pajamas. And when she knocked on the door at 9:30 at night, Dom answered, looking exhausted with grease still under his fingernails from work. The second he saw her, his whole face transformed, and Nessa said, I'm sorry I left. I'm sorry I pushed you away. I was drowning in grief and I convinced myself you only stayed out of pity. But Oliver left me a letter and he told me to be happy. And Dom, you make me happy. You make me want to live again." Dom pulled her inside and wrapped his arms around her and said, "I never pitied you, not for one single second. I fell in love with you that night in the diner when you were at your lowest, and I've been in love with you every day since. Through Oliver's decline and his death and your grief, all of it, I chose all of it because I chose you." Nessa was crying into his chest and said, "I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be happy when Oliver's not here to see it." And Dom said, "So we learn together, one day at a time, and we honor him by actually living instead of just surviving." Sophie came running down the stairs in her pajamas, and when she saw Nessa, she screamed, "You came back!" and threw herself into Nessa's arms so hard they both almost fell over. Sophie was crying and saying, "I missed you so much. Daddy was so sad, but he said we had to give you space. Are you staying this time? Please say you're staying." And Nessa said, "I'm staying, baby. I'm so sorry I left. I'm staying forever if you'll have me." The next few months were about rebuilding what grief had tried to destroy. Nessa moved back in officially and got a new job as a hospice care coordinator, helping families navigate end-of-life care. And every day she felt like she was honoring Oliver's memory by making sure other kids got the compassionate care he'd received. Dom kept working at the auto shop, but he started coming home at normal hours instead of pulling 80-hour weeks. And they had family dinners every night where Sophie would tell them about school and they'd all share one good thing from their day. On December 10th, which was Oliver's real birthday, Dom told Nessa he wanted to take her somewhere. And when they pulled up to the cemetery, she knew exactly where they were going. They walked to Oliver's grave, which had a beautiful headstone with Spider-Man carved into the granite and fresh flowers that Sophie had left the day before. And Dom got down on one knee in the cold December snow and pulled out a small velvet box. He said, Oliver brought us together, Nessa. He's the reason we met and the reason we're standing here. I wanted him to be part of this moment because he'll always be part of our story. Dom opened the box showing a simple silver ring with a tiny diamond that was all he could afford and said, Vanessa Laurent, will you marry me? Will you let me spend every day for the rest of my life making sure you know you're loved and cherished and enough exactly as you are? Nessa was nodding before he even finished and said, yes, this ring is perfect because it came from you. I don't need expensive. I just need real. And this is the most real thing I've ever felt. Yes, I'll marry you. They got married the following May on the one-year anniversary of Oliver's death because Nessa said, I want to turn the saddest day into something beautiful. I want to remember May 4th as the day I married the love of my life instead of only the day I lost my son. The ceremony was in Dom's sister's backyard with white flowers everywhere and about 30 people who'd supported them through the hardest year of their lives. And Sophie was the flower girl wearing a lavender dress because that had been Oliver's favorite color. Sophie walked down the aisle carrying a framed photo of Oliver that she placed on an empty chair in the front row. And she said loud enough for everyone to hear, Oliver's here too. He gets to see his mom get married. Dom's vows made every single person cry when he said, you showed me that strength isn't about never breaking. It's about putting yourself back together. Oliver showed me what truly matters in this short life we get. Together, you both saved me from sleepwalking through my existence and taught me how to actually live with an open heart. Nessa's vows were, Oliver taught me that love doesn't end when someone dies. It just changes shape. You taught me that my broken heart could heal and grow and make room for new love without erasing the old. Sophie taught me that family isn't about biology. It's about who shows up and stays. I promise to show up for both of you every single day for the rest of my life. They released purple balloons after the ceremony with messages to Oliver written on tags. And Sophie's message said, we're a family now, just like you wanted. I'm telling everyone about you just like I promised. I love you forever. 2 years later, Dom and Nessa had a baby girl who they named Olivia after Dom's late wife because both the women they'd lost had shaped who they'd become and brought them to each other. And Sophie, at 12 years old, was the most devoted big sister, constantly telling baby Olivia stories. Dom would come home from the shop to find Sophie holding the baby saying, you had a big brother named Oliver who was so brave. He had cancer, but he never stopped smiling. And he's the reason Mommy and Daddy found each other. He's your guardian angel. They still visited Oliver's grave every month as a family, and they'd bring flowers and Sophie's artwork and tell him about their lives. And Nessa would say, we're happy, Oliver, just like you asked. We're really, truly happy, and you're still part of every good thing. They were still struggling financially because Dom was still a mechanic making $40,000 a year, and Nessa's hospice job didn't pay much better. But they had a small house and food on the table, and each other, and that was worth more than any amount of money. Sometimes the worst moments of your life lead you straight to the best people. Dom saw a woman crying on a blind date on Valentine's Day, and he could have walked away, could have finished his $2 coffee, and caught his bus and never thought about her again. Nessa confessed that her 5-year-old son was dying, and her date got up and walked out calling her situation too heavy and too much baggage. And Dom, who was a complete stranger with $2 in his pocket, chose to stay, chose to see her pain and sit with it and eventually love her through it. Not everyone can handle loving someone in crisis. Not everyone has the courage to show up when things get impossibly hard and stay when it would be easier to leave. But the right person doesn't see your grief as a burden. They see your strength in surviving. Oliver lived 5 beautiful years, and in his final months, he gave his mother a gift she didn't even know she needed. He brought her a man who would love her in her darkest valley and a daughter who would become family. If you're in the hardest chapter of your life right now, if you're grieving or struggling or convinced you're too broken to ever be loved, your person is out there, and they won't run when things get messy. They'll stay and fight beside you and love you through the impossible moments. Hit subscribe if this reminded you that love chooses us in our worst moments. Share this with someone who needs hope. And remember, your hardest season is just one chapter, not your whole story.